moment the video times out, please let me know. Oh, there we go. You got it. Hey, what's going on, brother?
Okay.
How you doing?
All right. Hopefully that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. I like the background. Are you in a lab right now? What's going on?
I was trying to find a good spot in my apartment that had good lighting and good Wi-Fi, and I have a bar set up, so I figured I would just sit here.
Okay, right on. Well, very cool. So let's go right into it. Yesterday on my page, I posted, like, who would you like to see on our show? And I got a bunch of, like, great names, very famous competitors. And when I posted that I was going to have you, I had this one guy message me, and he was like, who's that guy? Like, I've never heard of him before. Does he even compete? And for people in the know, you are regarded as one of the best kept secrets of jiu-jitsu. You're very much behind the scenes. You train a lot of high-level competitors, as well as developing strategy. So just to kind of give people a little bit more background on you, how did you get started with jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, that's a good idea, because a lot of the newer jiu-jitsu students and fans probably wouldn't have any idea who I am, especially in the last few years if you just started. But I started way back in the 90s, like most grapplers of my generation. We got into it from watching the first few UFCs and how most people saw it in like 93 and 94, and they saw Hoist Gracie and they were inspired by that. I was too, but in a little different way. I was also inspired by seeing Ken Shamrock, who was his kind of the villain in that whole story. And I thought it was really strange how such a huge bodybuilder looking guy decided to drop to the ground and look for leg attacks when it looked like he was obviously the physically superior person. So that had as much as an effect on me as much as seeing Hoist Gracie at his lightweight, submitting all the different weight classes that he faced. So going off of that, I decided to try and learn as much as I could about jiu-jitsu, and especially learning what Ken Shamrock knew, like the leg locks. And at the time, in the early 90s, since there was no internet, there was no way for me to really analyze any of the footage other than what I had on my VHS tape. I had to try and just get magazines, cut them out, and piece them together and try and figure things out. But then it gave me a unique set of eyes to look at jiu-jitsu, though. But luckily, in like '96, they started airing from Japan the Pancrase fights. So I got to see Shamrock and Frank Shamrock and even other Brazilians fighting in that format. So they always were looking for toe holds and knee bars and heel hooks. And so because that's what was accessible for me, it made it much easier for me to absorb that rather than jiu-jitsu, because I had no instructor. There was no jiu-jitsu around at that time on Long Island that I knew of. So by being able to study those fights and learning all the locks below the waist at that time, it gave me a very different perspective than most who jumped right into jiu-jitsu.
Of course.
Especially because I managed to get a lot of footage on, I don't know if you remember Oleg Taktarov from the UFC.
I do.
So I used to love watching him, and he did a seminar in upstate New York where I went to college one time, and I got to see firsthand, like rolling knee bars from the feet and takedowns using leg locks and things like that. So before I even had a base in jiu-jitsu, I was learning a lot of leg entanglements, and decided to compete from that point, and used only leg locks at the time, and then realized when I faced a good jiu-jitsu person how much of a weakness it was to just have the leg locks alone.
Let me ask you a question, because for people that are watching that don't know, you have your black belt under Matt Serra, correct?
Correct, yes.
And how was he with leg locks? Because I think a lot of people, after watching the John Danaher interview with Joe Rogan, they became a little bit more familiar with the backstory of how the whole leg locks came around. So when you were training with him, was that something that they were already implementing?
So I first met him in around 2000, 2001. He watched one of my fights in a tournament, invited me to come and train, and I have to give him credit that probably within the very first lesson I ever had with him, we started from a position in pancrase and in shoot fighting, they used to call it a noose, and now it morphed into terms of single leg X and ashi and things like that. But he taught that position, and if you watch in his first UFC appearance, he uses that same standard single leg X to isolate the leg and to sweep. And so he taught me that probably on my first day, just because it was a private lesson. And he was very, very involved with it at the time, especially because he had at the Renzo Gracie Academy in the early 90s when he was there, as you heard from other interviews, Dean Lister showed up and tried to ankle lock everybody. He was one of the only few that was successful at escaping them.
Yeah, I remember. That's crazy. So let me ask you this. In your experience, with everything that you've been through, how has your experience kind of shaped your approach to jiu-jitsu or to BJJ? And not just like from the instructional part or the instructional point of view, but, does it kind of like transcend into your everyday life?
Of course. To answer the first part of the question is that because like I said, my perspective is a little different, being that through all the trends in jiu-jitsu, as long as it's been, pretty much in the U.S., I've been in some form of it, around for some part of it. And the perspective of starting with leg locks and then moving on from there gave me the impression that when I started to teach students, I didn't want to be able to have them say, we're going to start in closed guard and you're going to learn how to do an arm bar. I don't teach any white belts closed guard technique, which sounds kind of odd, but I don't like closed circuit moves where you have, for example, like your legs connected or your hands connected, and it invites people to squeeze. And when you have a white belt in a closed guard, they fear opening their legs, and that freedom that allows, they feel that people are going to jump over their guard, and that chaos kind of scares them.
Makes sense.
So I teach all white belts how to get from the bottom into, for example, single leg X, and sweeping from those positions where we don't have to have a position that's a holding position. And I don't want to use the term stalling because obviously it's a negative term. Obviously, the more holding you do is possibly the more energy you expend. So I've always felt that it's best to have the students start with positions that are a little bit more fluid than learning something that involves a hold or a squeeze.
Okay.
That's how I've always done it.
Yeah, I mean that sounds very logical. So going to the next part.
Yes.
Do you feel like, in your experience as an instructor, that BJJ can go a little bit further than just on the mats? Like, is there like a transcendental like kind of aspect to it?
Oh, of course, and I'm sure you can relate with this. And anybody who trains, the feeling of being involved in jiu-jitsu, especially when you have a passion for it, and you are on the mats and you're training, your training for that day can theoretically make or break the rest of your day. Your outlook kind of changes sometimes when you leave jiu-jitsu. Sometimes people feel that they feel great afterwards and they can't wait to get on with the rest of their day. It's a great start. And then sometimes you have poor days in the gym and you don't get to pull off the things you wanted to, or you're upset about being dominated by somebody. And in those sort of situations, like, you have to realize that judging things on a day-by-day basis when you're training can lead to a lot of unhappiness outside of jiu-jitsu, and you take that home with you. So that's what I mean when it could potentially alter your mood in your non-jiu-jitsu life.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Obviously, like, there's no other time in your day where you're really trying with all your mental faculties and all of your physical prowess to solve a problem other than jiu-jitsu. There's no parallel in the rest of your life that's similar to that, which is why learning how to deal with that is so great, because it'll turn the volume down on the rest of your life and allow you to focus better. And that's what I've learned from it in all these years, that I have a lot of patience in most things outside of jiu-jitsu, and I also, really don't get a lot of nerves, and I don't panic, and it's all just from training and being in bad and uncomfortable spots. and just learning to try and think rationally through it, honestly. And that's one of the biggest lessons out of it.
I can agree more. So often when I meet people that practice jiu-jitsu, they tend to be very calm, very relaxed, and they have no ego. And definitely, I think like the problem-solving, aspect of jiu-jitsu that you can take away from that is just so unique to jiu-jitsu. I mean, you hear it all the time, like people say, jiu-jitsu saved my life in more ways than one. And especially, I mean, you're from New York in that area, especially here in, like, for example, the West Coast, San Diego, LA. When you're driving in traffic, you need like that Zen Buddhist mentality. And I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten out of like a road rage type of fight incident because of jiu-jitsu. It just
absolutely
you can't beat that.
They always say you're learning to become comfortable in uncomfortable situations, and that's priceless.
That's exactly it. So you like I said, you're very much behind the scenes. You work with a lot of athletes, a lot of top competitors. Eddie Cummings being one of them, of course. Everyone is familiar with him. But are there any other pros or competitors that you work with?
Yeah, well, Eddie started with me as a white belt, and we went to I was teaching at the university where he went at Stony Brook University, and at that time too, there was also John Sateva, who started with me, and he's a professional right now as well. Under Marcelo Garcia, he competes for, but it's rare to find an instructor that has a student from white belt to black and goes on to compete at high levels. Usually a lot of well-known instructors get students at a purple belt or brown belt level that seek them out, and they are able to refine them, and as opposed to taking a student that is raw, that doesn't know anything, and trying to instill the proper views and mentality to look at your training and be able to get their most efficient techniques out, as opposed to, like I said, you could have a gem into your gym and it's easy to polish them, but it's harder to really make that gem from nothing. Meaning that, a lot of pros, as they travel and they go to different gyms, they are able to make a name for themselves. Sometimes Eddie and I joke around and we say that, I might be the best white belt instructor there is, because
that's
I'm
good.
able to kind of give them the right set of eyes to move on with. And, I'm happy about that, because it's not easy taking people off the street and getting them to learn good technique. I'm kind of proud of that. So.
Of course, and another thing too that, by the way, I don't know if you can hear, there's like a little echo going on, and I do apologize to anyone that's watching if you guys are getting this feedback. Someone still made a comment on that, but someone apparently in Australia has no problem. So I do apologize, but we're just going to go right through it. So, yeah. I mean, you're credited in being this great strategist. So let me ask you, I come to you and, I want to compete. How do we build a strategy for me to go and compete at that high level?
So one of the things that's necessary for a good coach or instructor or strategist is that it's not enough to just be good, in quotes, at jiu-jitsu. You have to be a fan of the sport, because it's okay if you're a fighter and you want to become good. You don't necessarily have to watch all the tournaments that are out there. But for me to be a good strategist and a good coach, I have to know everything that's going on, so I know all the players in the game. I have to follow trends and be able to forecast those trends. So in my spare time, a lot of it is spent just poring over film and watching old tournaments and current tournaments and matches and fights and seeing what's happening and what is necessary to look out for. So first of all, when you come to me, part of the thing that I'm able to do is give you a good idea of what can be expected, especially for the format you might be going into, whether it's IBJJF or if it's sub-only, or if there's, Abu Dhabi rules, things like that. Because I'm aware of those sets of rules, we could form a strategy around that. And then from there, I'd need to know what are your attributes and what is your game, what does it entail? I'm not going to take you, if you pride yourself on being a reverse De La Riva player, I'm not going to stand you up and have you work takedowns necessarily.
Right.
We're going to work with what your attributes are already, and then just give you things that I know that your opponent wouldn't expect. I'm good with tempos, knowing the tempos of the fight and how to tell when people are strictly coming from a school that just, that drills incessantly, as opposed to having a more mindful approach. So having me, picking out fights for you and being able to tailor your training, it really is something that's unique, because you're getting an opportunity to have a plan tailor-made for you, as opposed to going into a classroom, absorbing the techniques that they decide to teach that day, and hopefully some of it soaks in. My main skill is being able to communicate well with fighters, and being able to, whatever your background is, to use the same terminology you probably would, and to make sure that you soak it all up. And a lot of people learn so differently that I have to be able to make it accessible for whatever style of learning you have, whether it's, you're an auditory learner or a visual learner or a physical learner. I have to cater to all of those different ways. And that's kind of what makes me more successful in dealing with the individual and making game plans.
Now, is that something that's more like that, just kind of like that it's natural to you, or did you pick it up from someone? How did you kind of like develop that whole mindset?
I've picked up a lot, obviously, in jiu-jitsu. We're constantly standing on the shoulders of other geniuses that came before us. But
right.
As far as my teaching style, obviously you probably take a little bit from your previous instructors, but my background has always been, whether it's in jiu-jitsu or in academic backgrounds, is teaching and instructing. And I've always had I've always been pretty adept as far as getting my point across and making sure people understand. And the method that I use, like I said, came from my first experience, and this might help a lot of people who are watching today that are looking to get better at jiu-jitsu. I mean, a lot of people love jiu-jitsu, right?
Right.
And they love it, and they want to get better at it, but, loving it isn't enough. You can love jiu-jitsu and not get better. Jiu-jitsu doesn't love you, it doesn't want your love. It wants your toil.
It's very one-sided love.
Yes, it wants your toil. It wants your sacrifice, And so realizing that early on, when I first met Matt Serra, I didn't go to classes. When I realized that I could do private lessons with this guy that I would watch on DVDs of fighting in Abu Dhabi, I jumped on that opportunity. Even though it cost as much as a monthly subscription, a monthly pass to train at the school, I would do it once a week. And by doing a private once a week for an entire year, I drained all my money doing it, but it smoothed out all my rough edges. And he absolutely gave me my base in jiu-jitsu that without, I would never have been able to pile on other tech to that base. And
right.
By knowing that I learned best in private lesson settings, I think I tried to refine my process more and more, to the point that, like I said, even though I have a 20-year career in jiu-jitsu, I've fallen in so many pitfalls and in so many traps that have hindered my training and getting injured in silly ways, that I went through all that so that I can have and accelerate my students to avoid those pitfalls, because I did it already. So right. I suffered so they don't have to. And that's what I am constantly thinking in the back of my head as I work with people that have a lot of potential and can get people further ahead in a shorter amount of time than they would otherwise, like I said, maybe learning in a group setting. Because we still really don't know how to learn jiu-jitsu. We still don't. I mean, it's still so early.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like only 20 years still, it's really been in the United States at a popular level. And like I said, look at it in an academic background, that, you have people in classrooms, and not everybody in those classrooms learn that way. Some people need after-school help. Some people have to get tutors. And it's no different for jiu-jitsu, especially in something that's so complex and requires so much of your mind, so much of your body, so much commitment, all of these things make it more complicated than an average subject to study. So why wouldn't we realize that people have to learn it in different ways? And you heard me talk about drilling before because it's so popular. And I mean, I've done weekends like with the Mendez brothers and done seminars and camps and stuff. And this is years and years ago. And they put it in my head as far as the drilling goes. And it worked pretty much for me to be able to retain things like that. But I don't think that drilling is necessarily the answer to learning.
Really?
In my school of thought. Because drilling's basis is having you repeat a move ad nauseum to be able to burn it into muscle memory.
Correct.
But the problem is that, the drilling that you're doing, if you're doing, 100 reps of this one move, you're kind of in a mindless zone, in a state of no mind when you're doing it. And I'm on the other spectrum of thinking of how we should be learning, as far as everything that you're doing should be present and mindful and thoughtful. Because in jiu-jitsu, we can't put our head in a different location when we're fighting, as far as you might be doing a technique you learned in a drill, but you're doing it where there's no resistance that the person is giving you.
Right.
You have to hope you're doing the move right when you're doing it those 100 times. Otherwise, you've just ingrained a less than ideal technique into your muscle memory. And third, I mean, don't even get me started on the person you're drilling on. They're absorbing a bad move. They're absorbing and conditioning themselves to move in a way to facilitate you to do your drill properly. Mm-hmm. And you could potentially, in your subconscious, have that move, and you'll do the wrong thing when you're training because you're not even thinking properly there.
So then how would one be more mindful, more present when drilling? How would you gonna go to mitigate that?
So the method that I use to be able to get people to retain and to be mindful and present in their techniques, aside from drilling, is because I don't want people to treat their techniques like they're in the gym, right? Mm-hmm. In today's times where people are doing like HIIT training and doing this exhaustive workouts, which is great for your body and it makes you very tough and strong. You have to put your mind somewhere else when you do those things, and you just want to complete your reps. But jiu-jitsu shouldn't be that way, I feel. And I think that when you're doing techniques, the first thing you should do is, after you learn from a qualified instructor and you believe in his techniques, if I could even go back a little bit and say, and to do this as respectfully as possible, is question your instructor. Question them with the technique they're giving you. Ask them, is this a technique that you do regularly? Is this a technique that you have contingency plans for? I don't teach any technique that I don't use or was part of my repertoire personally. People see me all the time when I'm training, and I might do a technique and they ask me to teach it for the class, and I say, no. I said, I'm still using that technique. I'm not in a position where I feel ready enough to give it to you and answer any question about it. I didn't fully digest it yet. So once you find a technique that is sound and you have 100% assurance that it works, then you would get a partner and you would do your reps. You would rep with your partner. So you have a person that's 100% a willing participant that you're doing that technique with. And you do it for however many reps you might need. Let's say, 10 to 20 reps you're doing on this person. And it's not timed. It's not for speed. You're thinking about every motion that you're doing. Now, when you're doing this technique and this person is going along with you, there's no reason that you do that move any less than perfect. So we're looking for the ideal reps that you're making as you think it through. Mm-hmm. That's the first step. Then the second step, what we're looking to do is to be able to start taking that move onto the mat, and you're going to do it live. But you only do it with opponents that you choose that are smaller, weaker, less experienced than you. They're the fodder for this technique to survive. And you take these people, these maybe even teens or smaller people, and you have to be able to get these moves off from 0 to 100 over and over against an unwilling participant now. Now you're going against this person's free will, and you're inducing your move on them when they don't want it done.
So let me
Yeah.
I'm sorry. If I understand this correctly, so you're saying that you would recommend practicing with someone smaller and less experienced.
Correct.
Okay.
So after you rep the move and you have the move down in theory, then you go to practice. Practicing with somebody that you will have to be able to develop the confidence to pull the move off with.
I see.
People make the mistake all the time of after class, after private lessons, after seminars, to going and take that move that they learned and then going and training and trying to pull it off against their peers. How many times does it happen where you learn a new technique and if you've been training for a few years, you lose certain techniques because you didn't pull them off and they fall by the wayside and you move on to the next trend.
Right.
And it happens very often, and you could have lost a potentially world-beating technique that you could have had instilled into your arsenal. And it happens so often. People just glaze over techniques that could have been very good, but they didn't go through the right process to make sure it became theirs and it stays with them.
So the premise is confidence. You want to drill it, feel it, be confident with it. That way it'll stick in your repertoire, as opposed to drilling it once or twice. Class, try to do it with someone bigger and stronger than me. It didn't work out. I just move on to something else.
Right, because now when you say being confident with it, what does that really? That means that you're in a comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
Every time you get in your comfort zone, training or competing, you're the one that's most likely that's going to be able to think clearer and be able to pull off your techniques, because like we say, and I don't know who said this quote or if I said it before, but in good jiu-jitsu, there always has to be one comfortable person and the other one must be uncomfortable. So if you're in your comfort zone, you could guarantee that other person is fighting and defending. They're definitely not in a comfortable position. And that's the way we need to think of that. So the quicker you get to your comfort zone, the more in charge of the fight you're going to be.
That's great.
And then, the last step, so it's 3 steps.
Mm-hmm.
You're repping, then you're using it against people that you can physically dominate so you can gain confidence in the technique. And then third, and the final step, is being able to use said technique with confidence against your peers, going at people that are at your level and trying to pull it off. Now, obviously, the first and second time, third time, you're not going to pull off the technique, but this is the molding stage, whereas if you were sculpting, and it's going to be just little chips that you're making away at that technique as you get more and more confident with it. So as you do it, eventually you're going to have some form develop from it, but it takes a certain amount of chips of that hammer, and it has to be consistent if you want that technique to be useful and in your repertoire. Those 3 steps, if you follow them, you can have a technique that stays with you. And that's what I use for my students and for pro fighters and private lessons. And I find that's one of the easiest way to access high-level techniques.
It's really fascinating to say that because I heard Eddie Bravo. He said if you're a higher level, jiu-jitsu practitioner, purple belt and above, if you want to get better, drill on blue belts. So people that have some notion of what's going on, so they have the proper techniques to defend, like you said, like you don't want someone drilling an improper technique that's not going to work, and that's the best way to get better. So, I mean, it kind of like goes hand in hand with what you were saying. You want to drill with someone that maybe is not as competent as you, so you can develop that comfort zone.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because, people that just start jiu-jitsu, that it's such a high attrition rate for white belts and blue belts. People come and they start and they leave because BJJ is hard. Mm-hmm. There's no way around it. As a beginner coming in, it could be a terrible experience in the wrong circumstances. They leave because of that adversity, because of the difficulty. People avoid difficulty.
Right.
But if you're around good people and your instructor is showing you the right techniques to be able to survive against higher belts, just to try and survive and not get hurt and not walk out with your head hanging down, you could do well. And that's why people leave, is because they're tired of getting smashed by bigger people and higher belts. If you teach, like I said, I think one of the worst things to do is to teach that white belt a closed guard armbar against a higher belt that's going to stack them up and grind them out. Mm-hmm. You need to give them techniques that involve frames to get people's weight off of you. You need to be able to start isolating their limbs and learning to sweep. And then once they get confidence from there, they might start getting some offense in there. That's how you keep white belts to eventually become blue belts, not by just using them as fodder for the upper belts, you know,
Right.
even though I'm saying you could learn that way too, but
Mm-hmm.
you have to give the white belts the right technique, definitely.
Great.
You know what Eddie Bravo means, yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because you were saying, you know, how much like you study film and how you're so focused on it, so you're always aware of trends. You know, in regards to social media, what are your thoughts about people sharing techniques? Like, is that something that's a good idea? Is it helping the sport evolve faster? Or if, let's say that I'm like an Eddie Cummings, right? I wouldn't want to put my best techniques out there because they're only going to eventually just work against me in competition. So I guess I'm trying to ask, what are your thoughts on sharing techniques on social media?
So most people that know me pretty well, and a lot of pros know that I'm very stingy with my techniques. I'm very stingy with A-game technique, precisely. And the reason is that besides like for the entire length of time I've been training, there are times that, you know, everybody in their career, they're going to probably discover something that works easier for them. And, you know, I don't like saying, you know, you made a new move, but you just discovered something. And you're going to discover stuff that work really well for you. And if it works well for you and you keep trying it over and over and you have easily reproducible results, then you might have something there. And then if you could take that move and pass it on to somebody else, now we're past the R&D phase, and now you could use it on mass consumers, and we might actually have a legitimate, well thought out technique. So sometimes these sort of things can take months at a time, especially, you know, if you're training often, and I'm working on a specific technique, and I know that I'm getting to use it every day, and I'm using it against a wide variety of sizes and belts. I know that I have something legitimate there. And so that time that I invested into it, I noticed that there are times where I might go to a school's open mat or training somewhere else, and then I'll see somebody videotaping me rolling. And Eddie Cummings does this too, that when we train other places, we don't use A-game stuff because of people poaching.
Wow.
And poaching happens, and it's a natural thing, especially as a competitor. It's an arms race, and you're constantly trying to find the most advanced tech that could be used to submit somebody. If I find an easier way than what you're used to, you're going to be interested in it. And especially when, like I said, it's competition involved. Potentially there's money involved.
Right.
So I feel very reticent about sharing those techniques with people outside of, you know, my school and my students, or people that are coming to do private lessons with me, because it's something that I call tech traveling. Not time travel, but tech travel, where I might spend 6 months developing a technique that I know works across the board on any belt and any size with the right setup. And then you might have somebody who sees my technique and figures it out. And now I just saved them potentially a year of training to figure things like this out. And they just went ahead that far with that technique that I spent and I toiled and I suffered for. And that kind of tech travel is the thing that we worry about as high-level people, that once these moves get out there and they don't give credit, then it's kind of upsetting to do. And, you know, obviously you're thinking about competition and you're worried that, you know, people will see the move and then potentially work ways around it before you even debut the technique. So, you know, in the academic world, we have to, whenever we say something, we have to cite our sources. And I look at jiu-jitsu the same way. I want it to be in the same format, that you give credit where credit is due. And, you know, that applies for everything in jiu-jitsu. When you're talking about techniques or you're posting online, say that you saw it at this place, you know, or this person is who you believe discovered the technique.
Right.
Like,
yeah, you're asking way too much people, man, especially with competition and money on the line. I mean, it's
yeah.
I guess it's normal. It's unfortunate, but it's one of those inescapable things. And I think it's pretty interesting the way that you refer to it as technique poaching or poaching. I never really thought of it like that.
Yeah, and I mean we all do it.
Right.
I mean, like I said, from the way that I learned, like I said, I learned from picking up techniques from magazines 20 years ago. So my eyes can pick up a lot of interesting movements. And so I'm probably the ultimate poacher. I could walk into somewhere and see a brilliant blue belt pulling off a move that's, years ahead of his tech. And I'll burn it into my brain so that I could rep it and make it into something useful later. But I'll make sure to go to that blue belt and say, that's no good. You better stop working on that.
Mm-hmm.
Just to make sure that they don't follow my path,
Right.
But, it's important to give credit where it's due, especially when you look at today's modern leg lock, the amount of following that it has, I feel that Eddie Cummings is the person who's the impetus behind all of that.
Oh, that's no argument there.
That before, remember, he came from me, and we worked leg locks, but nothing compared to what he went off and he developed. My leg locks were very crude compared to the system that he spawned into that is known for today. And I mean, in competition, I think the watershed moment really is in competition where he was able to go from butterfly on the bottom, elevate somebody, and putting them into an inside triangle and getting into leg laces. That was like him, carving the wheel in modern day jiu-jitsu, and then other people took that wheel and applied it to different things. And then from there, the squad picked it up, and they all bounced ideas off of each other. And without him, there would never have been any squad in the first place. If you're familiar with that story of how the squad started with him, as far as when he was with me, he actually had to go away to a different university in the city, and so he was trying to figure out where he should train when he was away. And one of my students was at Marcelo's, so he says, I'm going to go to Henzo's. And so he went there, and he was doing really well. Our submission-based problem solving worked really well when he went there, and he got noticed immediately. And he started to really refine all his leg entanglements as a blue belt. And during that time, there was really any of the pros you know of now weren't there at the time. But when Gary Tonin would go and visit, he would train with Eddie, and he didn't know who Eddie was. He just knew that this guy was dominating him with these leg locks and these transitions.
Right.
And because of him, because of Eddie, he got Gary Tonin to stay and train there. And their professor there at Henzo's, yes. And then eventually Tonin brought his student Gordon Ryan there. And by them coming to kind of absorb what Eddie had, and then Eddie's professor there was able to digest all of that and I guess make it into, chronicle it into bite-sized chunks to be able to reiterate it for other students and stuff. They all kind of bounce these ideas around to make what is known today as the modern leg lock system. But you just have to remember that Eddie's the impetus behind all of that. And I don't think he's too humble to ever come out and say that, but I would, because I feel he deserves the credit.
Eddie's a fascinating guy. I've never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I've seen a lot of interviews. I wanted to ask you about this because he started jiu-jitsu a little bit later than most, correct?
Correct.
He was a little bit older. I think he was, 26, 27? Which
I'm not sure of the age, but I just know that, he was definitely, past the age of when most people would start, especially when they're becoming a pro.
Correct.
And, he picked it up definitely later on. But he was not a talent. He wasn't somebody that, he came and learned a few techniques and did amazing. He was somebody who had an incredible work ethic, and he applied an analytical style to his training to be able to, I always pushed my students to try and take notes on what they did. And I give the example of saying, you see people in the gym and they have a notebook with them and they're writing down their reps and their weights and what exercises they're doing. And if they're doing it for a single-minded thing like going to the gym, why are we doing it in the, the most comprehensive mind, body, exhausting experience like jiu-jitsu?
That
And
sounds
so
very
I
much.
push, I push people to make notes. And so he was constantly always taking notes and repping. And he definitely pushed himself by, I mean, he would make dummies at home, like from, using rods from curtains and things like that. And he needed to do that
No.
to satisfy his compulsion for jiu-jitsu. And, he worked really hard. But he also had really, even like his first tournaments were good experiences, though. And, he was finishing everybody like that. But yeah, he definitely started later, but he accelerated because he committed and sacrificed everything in his life to become good.
That
When
was
he
my
got,
question,
yeah,
because he's a fascinating guy, and by no means is being in your 20s late, but in comparison to a lot of these people that start, when they're young, especially still, like they're born in a gi. I mean, one would say that he's playing catch up and is at a huge disadvantage. And my question is, like, what makes him so special? But I mean, it's obvious. I mean, he was very disciplined, and he had an obsession. And when you have that healthy obsession, of course, you're able to make those giant strides and progress a lot faster in comparison to a lot of other people. So I was going to ask you, like, how is it training?
I'm sorry?
When you're training with him, like, how is it? Like the back and forth?
It's training with him it's something your body knows about definitely the next day, that everything is super tight. When him and I roll with each other, he's, trying to make sure everything is perfect. His posture is perfect. I'm watching his elbows, making sure they're in. He comes to me physically for learning to hand fight properly. That's something that I push. And if you want to know about like forecasting trends in jiu-jitsu, the next big push will be for learning how to hand fight and make grips from the ground properly. And it's something that him and I toil over every time we're together, and about making efficient grips that aren't taxing us, but that the other person can't run away from either. And it's a lot of off balancing when we go at each other. But for the most part, it's pretty smart training. I absorbed an injury about a year ago, and I had to have my ACL reconstructed and stuff. And
What'd you do? Which one? What you go with?
I'm sorry?
Did you do a replacement?
Yeah, I had an ACL reconstruction, and it was a cadaver put in, and then I had to have my meniscus repaired as well.
Same injury.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yep.
I didn't know that. Interesting. But yeah, him and I were rolling, and it was just a fluke that happened. It wasn't like he did something that wasn't being very careful. It was just a fluke movement that caused it, and it's nothing that should deter anybody from thinking that leg locks are more dangerous, because it was two very mindful people that were training. But for the most part, we get a lot out of it. I mean, he helps me a ton learning his system, and I try and help him as much as I can with the mindset and keeping him calm for fights. And this last fight was great. I mean, the three of us have a great system when he's fighting. Myself and Otavia and Eddie, we work really well together. And for those last two fights that he had, went really well. It's unfortunate that his opponent, Canuto, didn't engage him, but he's used to that by now, that he has a hard time finding people that are going to engage him, and just wanting to fight him in general is the problem.
Right, yeah, I mean, of course. And again, I'm seeing some of the comments. I do apologize about the echo. I don't know what's going on, but hey, when you're doing stuff live, it's the shit that happens. But yeah, no, I mean, for a while, I mean, I don't think we saw a lot of Eddie. I know that he had a injury, but in regards to him, the squad, that was something that I think a lot of people were asking, like, hey, we really haven't been seeing him compete, under that banner. So, I mean, if it's not too much to ask, and I can just ask about it since, you guys are so close, is there something that happened, and why is he still part of the squad?
No, he's really not. He hasn't been with the squad in over a year, and I think because Eddie is not the most accessible person social media wise, he doesn't talk about these things, and nor should he have to. I mean, it's not right if he doesn't feel it's anybody's business. But now it's to the point where he's definitely a true life Ronin, where he trains on his own and he goes to find wherever he can train or teach at, and it's a very, I guess you could say, it's sort of covert training. where you don't have other people that could potentially be your opponent watching you all the time or trying to train with you. And sometimes when he was still with the squad, you had people that were vying to be champions at his weight class that was there. And you can imagine how it could be potentially stressful to train with people that you could be fighting with in the tournament, or trying to retain your title against somebody that knows most of your A game. And so it doesn't make sense to train in that kind of environment when it's super stressful.
That's unfortunate.
So definitely, yeah, he separated himself from that, and possibly from the entire Renzo Gracie Association, you know. But, you know, that's why I felt it's important to kind of stress that, you know, most of these techniques that you're seeing on these DVDs that are coming out lately, just to know that if it wasn't for Eddie Cummings' obsession, we wouldn't be in this position today. You know?
I mean, I'll be honest. I don't think I would have been as passionate with leg locks if it wasn't for he definitely, I think, inspired a new generation of leg lockers. And it must be tough for him because there's so much film. I mean, you go to YouTube, you type in heel hook, and how many Eddie Cummings videos out, and there's just hours and hours of all his tournaments, competition, breakdown of all his techniques. And I mean, that's crazy. I mean, it's definitely a blessing and a curse.
Think about it that way. So that is one deficiency that happens when you're successful, is that there is so much film on him for people to prepare for. But just know that behind closed doors, you know, we work on such different, I guess you could say, strategies from what you see in those videos, like what Canuto felt compared to what you see him doing in those EBIs that he won. It's very different, and it's not something that is very easy to see. But what I can say is that the BJJ technology that we're working now is very interesting, high-level, lethal stuff. And people can really watch as much as they want. They won't be prepared once they feel what it's like to be gripped by him and to be off-balanced by him. It's really something quite foreign to the average, or I should say, to the elite professional fighters out there, that when you're gripped by him, you know. And I'd say I get most of my business from people that train or fight Eddie, and then they want to learn how to deal with that. And that's why most of the pros I train like to stay anonymous.
I understand. Yeah, I mean, you could watch so many videos about, like, swimming with sharks, but it's not until you're in the shark tank and you go, like, oh, shit, you understand the gravity of the situation.
Yeah. And that's what it's like. But, yeah, right at this moment, the hardest thing is just getting people to sign to fight him, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. And it's unfortunate. The same thing I was just talking about with Ryan Hall. You know, why he hasn't fought in a while. It's hard to want to pick up fights, especially when you're notorious, you know, for certain techniques, and people just know, it's like, man, like, I can't stop him. Because, I mean, like, you know best, right? I mean, you guys know each other's games back and forth, and you know, still, you know, they're able to land those techniques.
Of course, yeah. Even though you see them coming, those people that put the work in and they make sure that most of their waking hours are spent thinking of these strategies, it's very hard to stop. And then the physical component combined with it, it's so hard. You know, you have athletes out there that are learning high-level techniques. It becomes too much to think about and trying to prevail. It's tough.
Yeah, and I know that Eddie's notorious for studying film as well, so he's a well-rounded, very dangerous,
he's a
smart
student of the game. Yeah.
Well, great, man. Well, let me just ask you this: if somebody wants to train with you, if somebody wants to, you know, learn some more leg locks or develop some strategies for competition, how can they go find you, get a hold of you?
Great. Yeah, you could direct message me here on Instagram, and I could give you more information at Krishna001. I teach out of the school in Center Reach on Long Island at Red Dragon Jiu-Jitsu. You could look that up if you want to come and take group classes, and then you could just contact me personally for private lessons. I travel a lot, so probably where you are, I'd be at some time anyway. But,
well, yep.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Great. I mean, you know what? Hopefully, I definitely will have time to meet and train with you sometime. My girlfriend
Yes.
actually lives on the East Coast, so hopefully
Oh,
very soon, if I drop by, I'll give you a call, let you know. And
that'd be great.
yeah, that'd be awesome. Well, man, thank you so much. I do appreciate your time, and I do apologize for the echo. As I'm speaking, I'm hearing the echo, and it is a little bit annoying. But thank you so much, man.
My pleasure, Hector. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Next week, I have two more guests. I have Alex Eklund. He's regarded for like being the pioneer of the G roll, as well as Eric, the gentleman. He's the head coach for the Paquette top team. So stay tuned. Let you guys know about that. All right, guys. Thank you so much, man. See you later.
See you, man.
Bye. Any moment the video times out, please let me know. Oh, there we go. You got it. Hey, what's going on, brother?
Okay.
How you doing?
All right. Hopefully that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. I like the background. Are you in a lab right now? What's going on?
I was trying to find a good spot in my apartment that had good lighting and good Wi-Fi, and I have a bar set up, so I figured I would just sit here.
Okay, right on. Well, very cool. So let's go right into it. Yesterday on my page, I posted, like who would you like to see on our show? And I got a bunch of like great names, very famous competitors. And when I posted that I was gonna have you, I had this one guy message me, and he was like, "Who's that guy? Like I've never heard of him before. Does he even compete?" And for people in the know, you are regarded as one of the best kept secrets of jiu-jitsu. You're very much behind the scenes. You train a lot of high-level competitors, as well as developing strategy. So just kind of give people a little bit more background on you. How did you get started with jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, that's a good idea, because a lot of the newer jiu-jitsu students and fans probably wouldn't have any idea who I am, especially in the last few years if you just started. But I started way back in the 90s, like most grapplers of my generation. We got into it from watching the first few UFCs, and how most people saw it in like 93 and 94, and they saw Royce Gracie and they were inspired by that. I was too, but in a little different way. I was also inspired by seeing Ken Shamrock, who was his kind of the villain in that whole story. And I thought it was really strange how such a huge bodybuilder-looking guy decided to drop to the ground and look for leg attacks when it looked like he was obviously the physically superior person. So that had as much as an effect on me as much as seeing Royce Gracie at his lightweight, submitting all the different weight classes that he faced. So going off of that, I decided to try and learn as much as I could about jiu-jitsu, and especially learning what Ken Shamrock knew, like the leg locks. And at the time, in the early 90s, since there was no internet, there was no way for me to really analyze any of the footage other than what I had on my VHS tape. I had to try and just get magazines, cut them out, and piece them together and try and figure things out. But then it gave me a unique set of eyes to look at jiu-jitsu, though. But luckily, in like '96, they started airing from Japan the Pancrase fights. So I got to see Shamrock and Frank Shamrock and even other Brazilians fighting in that format. So they always were looking for toe holds and knee bars and heel hooks. And so because that's what was accessible for me, it made it much easier for me to absorb that rather than jiu-jitsu, because I had no instructor. There was no jiu-jitsu around at that time on Long Island that I knew of. So by being able to study those fights and learning all the locks below the waist at that time, it gave me a very different perspective than most who jumped right into jiu-jitsu.
Of course.
Especially because I managed to get a lot of footage on, I don't know if you remember Oleg Taktarov from the UFC.
I do.
So I used to love watching him, and he did a seminar in upstate New York where I went to college one time, and I got to see firsthand, like rolling knee bars from the feet and takedowns using leg locks and things like that. So before I even had a base in jiu-jitsu, I was learning a lot of leg entanglements, and decided to compete from that point, and used only leg locks at the time, and then realized when I faced a good jiu-jitsu person how much of a weakness it was to just have the leg locks alone.
Let me ask you a question, because for people that are watching that don't know, you have your black belt under Matt Serra, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And how was he with leg locks? Because I think a lot of people, after watching the John Danaher interview with Joe Rogan, you know, they became a little bit more familiar with the backstory of how the whole leg locks came around. So when you were training with him, was that something that they were already implementing?
So I first met him in around 2000, 2001. He watched one of my fights in a tournament, invited me to come and train, and I have to give him credit that probably within the very first lesson I ever had with him, we started from a position in Pancrase and in shoot fighting, they used to call it a noose, and now it morphed into terms of single leg X and ashi and things like that. But he taught that position, and if you watch in his first UFC appearance, he uses that same standard single leg X to isolate the leg and to sweep. And so he taught me that probably on my first day, just because it was a private lesson, and he was very, very involved with it at the time, especially because he had at the Renzo Gracie Academy in the early 90s when he was there, as you heard from other interviews, Dean Lister showed up and tried to ankle lock everybody. He was one of the only few that was successful at escaping them.
Yeah, I remember. That's crazy. So let me ask you this. In your experience, you know, with everything that you've been through, how has your experience kind of shaped your approach to jiu-jitsu or to BJJ? And not just like from the instructional part or the instructional point of view, but, you know, does it kind of like transcend into your everyday life?
Of course. To answer the first part of the question is that because like I said, my perspective is a little different, being that through all the trends in jiu-jitsu, as long as it's been, you know, pretty much in the U.S., I've been in some form of it, around for some part of it. And the perspective of starting with leg locks and then moving on from there gave me the impression that when I started to teach students, I didn't want to be able to have them say, we're going to start in closed guard and you're going to learn how to do an arm bar. I don't teach any white belts closed guard technique, which sounds kind of odd, but I don't like closed circuit moves where you have, for example, like your legs connected or your hands connected, and it invites people to squeeze. And when you have a white belt in a closed guard, they fear opening their legs, and that freedom that allows, they feel that people are going to jump over their guard, and that chaos kind of scares them.
Makes sense.
So I teach all white belts how to get from the bottom into, for example, single leg X, and sweeping from those positions where we don't have to have a position that's a holding position. And I don't want to use the term stalling because obviously it's a negative term. Obviously, the more holding you do is possibly the more energy you expend. So I've always felt that it's best to have the students start with positions that are a little bit more fluid than learning something that involves a hold or a squeeze.
Okay.
That's how I've always done it.
Yeah, I mean that sounds very logical. So going to the next part.
Yes.
Do you feel like, in your experience as an instructor, that BJJ can go a little bit further than just on the mats? Like, is there like a transcendental like kind of aspect to it?
Oh, of course, and I'm sure you can relate with this. And anybody who trains, the feeling of